Hi, folks. We've had 7 episodes where I've talked about a wave-based reality. Now let's talk about spirituality so that you have a grounding on what I'm going to be talking about from a wave-based perspective. And we talked earlier when we mentioned, or when I mentioned the paranormal or spiritual abilities of entities, that we are eternal beings. And if you have eternal beings in a wave-based reality that has multiple dimensions and that your consciousness can move between those dimensions, what's the purpose of our existence on Earth? And I'm happy to say, and this is what I say in my book, and it took me a long time to come to this point, but I think it's correct, is that it has to do with evolution. Now, that's interesting because we've had all these debates between creationism and evolution, but what we're talking about is spiritual evolution, not physical evolution. This is the evolution of our spiritual beings. And what I'd like to do to explain it is to show you an example from a book. It's actually by the famous Richard Dawkins and the Blind Watchmaker, which was one of the books that demonstrated the power of evolution. And in chapter 3 of his book, Professor Dawkins wrote about a computer program that he wrote to explain the power or show or illustrate the power of evolution. And what he did was he took a number of randomly generated characters, and let's just say for this example, it was 100. And he wanted to try and go from randomly generated characters to the phrase, "Methinks it's like a weasel," from the play Hamlet, which is 28 characters. And he created a program that would randomly change letters in each one of those instances. And if you calculate the probability statistically, it comes out to be 1 in 10 to the 40th power, which is a really tiny number. But what Dawkins did, which was so great in his book, is that he introduced an evolutionary function to it. And what he did is at the end of every instance or iteration that he did, he compared all the different iterations or instances of those randomly generated characters, and the one out of the 100 that came the closest to the objective, which was the phrase, "Methinks it's like a weasel," he made that the parent for all of the 100 instances in the next iteration. And he was able to, on average, come up with the phrase, "Methinks it's like a weasel," after about 50 iterations. So he went from 1 in 10 to the 40th to 50. And he did this 3 times, and it actually ranged from, I think, the mid 40s to the lower 60s, but it averaged out right about 50 iterations to get "Methinks it's like a weasel," which is a huge improvement. So that demonstrated the power of evolution. And I thought that that was a really great example, but it also has a spiritual evolution um, perspective to it as well. Because if you think about the objective function, "Methinks it's like a weasel," Scripture does the same thing, but from a spiritual standpoint. You have an unchanging Scripture that exists for thousands of years that multiple generations of human beings can reference. And if they find it and study it and apply it to their lives, they can evolve. And that unchanging Scripture is an objective function that allows people over multiple generations to evolve much faster than random probability. Now, the key in this, and one of the things that I'll talk about in the conclusions, is that you have to have an intergenerational transfer of that knowledge and that information, that wisdom. And if you look in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, where they talk about the Jewish Shema, which is the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, and all your soul. But a couple verses down below it, it says, "Tell it to your children. Talk about it as you walk through your day." And the whole idea is to do this inter and intra-generational transfer of this wisdom. And I think that's what's important when you talk about spiritual evolution, is that you have an intergenerational transfer of it. Now, what we're going to talk about in the next session is the culmination of spiritual evolution in the book of Revelation. So now I'm going to start talking about the Bible, but I'm going to talk about it from a wave-based reality perspective. And I think you'll be surprised at how the Scripture in Revelation, which people have been saying is a battle between good and evil and good wins. I say from a different perspective, from a wave-based perspective, it's a test of our spiritual maturity. And I hope you'll stay with me and join me for this next episode of Reality and Revelation. Take care.